A lot of people think there is conflict between science and religion, that somehow the two are opposed to each other, or that if you're really serious about science, you can't also be really serious about religion. And there are several different areas or loci, as you might call them, where these conflicts are supposed to arise. One would be that between, say, miracles and science. So Christians believe in miracles. They believe that Jesus rose from the dead, that Jesus turned water into wine, walked on water, and so on. Many Christians believe there are miracles that happen nowadays too, and the same goes for other religions. And many people think that there's a conflict between the idea that miracles do in fact happen on the one hand and what science teaches, that there are these laws and so on the other, because the thought is that if there are miracles, they go contrary to natural law. They break in quotes, these natural laws, which are promulgated by science, so there's conflict. I'm not going to talk about that. I don't think there is any conflict there, but that's one alleged area. Another would be scientific scripture scholarship. So the thought is if you look at scripture in a scientific way, study it as a scientific object, you wind up with ideas as to what it reports, quite different from those that are held by people who take the Bible seriously as God's Word, for example. And there are others as well, but I'm going to talk just about one area where there is alleged to be conflict, and that would be evolution, evolutionary theory. Many people think there is a conflict between evolution on the one hand and religious belief, Christian belief, belief in God on the other hand. Some of these people are, you might say, well to the right. They think they are serious evangelical, maybe fundamentalist Christians. They think there's a conflict there. Others are well to the left, scientists of various kinds, and others, philosophers, Richard Dawkins, for example, and various others, Daniel Dennett. And they say that there's a conflict here. And I want to begin just by talking briefly about that. Now, the first thing to note is that evolution covers a wide variety of according to the New Testament, grace covers a wide variety of sins. According to me, the term evolution covers a wide variety of theses, not necessarily sinful theses, just theses. So, for example, the ancient earth thesis, the idea that the world is very old, not merely 5,000 years, not 10,000 years, but maybe 4 billion, maybe even older than that. And second, there's a thesis of descent with modification, the idea that all of the enormous variety we find in the living world, sometimes in your living room too, but I'm thinking about the living world, all the enormous variety you find of different kinds of plants and different kinds of animals and so on, all comes to be by virtue of offspring differing, usually in relatively smallish ways, from their parents. The next thesis would be the common ancestry thesis, connected with the previous one, namely that if you pick any two living creatures and trace their ancestry back far enough, you'll come upon a common ancestor, right? So we are all cousins. We human beings are all cousins of each other, but well beyond that, we're really cousins of all the other kinds of animals as well as plant life too. So you and the poison ivy in your backyard are really cousins. Maybe distant cousins, and maybe in the case of some people it's easier to see than in others, but nonetheless cousins, all right? And then finally, the fourth thesis is what we could call Darwinism, which is the thought that the main mechanism driving this process of descent with modification is something like natural selection. I'm sure you've all heard of natural selection, working on some form of genetic variation, the most common candidate being random genetic mutation. All right, so by virtue of natural selection working on genetic variation that you'll wind up with all the vast variety that there is in the living world. Well, now, let's ask whether this is incompatible with Christian or theistic belief in God, all right? When I speak of Christian belief, I'm thinking of what you might call, what C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity. What you might think of as in common to all the great Christian creeds, the Apostles' Creed and the Catholic Baltimore Confession, the Heidelberg Catechism from the Reformed side of things, and the like. Roughly speaking, the intersection of these creeds would be mere Christianity. And when I think of theism, I'm thinking of the theistic religions. I'm thinking of Christianity and Islam and Judaism, all of which unite in supposing that there is this being, God, who is the creator of the world, is a person, is unlimited in power, in knowledge, and in love, all right? So if you ask yourself, with respect to these four theses, is evolution and is, mere Christianity incompatible with the ancient earth thesis? Well, presumably not. Some Christians think the world is very young, but that's not part of mere Christianity. That would be in addition to mere Christianity. As far as mere Christianity goes, the earth could be very old, just as it is, in fact, asserted to be by scientists. Well, what about the thesis of descent with modification? Now, theists believe that God has created the world, but he could have done so by means of some process of descent with modification. Again, there's no conflict between that and Christian belief, mere Christianity just as such. And the same would go for the common ancestry thesis. Maybe that's how God did things, how he created the living world. But what about Darwinism? The idea that what drives this whole process, what drives the whole thing, is this mechanism of natural selection working on some form of genetic variation, say random genetic variation, random genetic mutations of one kind or another. Well, there too, there's no obvious conflict because God could, if he wanted to, he could have done things by, I don't say he did things this way, maybe it's not even plausible to think that he did things this way, but he certainly could have brought it about that we have the kinds of life we have by virtue of such a process. In fact, as far as that goes, God could create, he could create the genetic mutations involved so he gets the right ones at the right time so he could guide the whole process in the direction he wants it to go. As far as I can see, there's no conflict there either. Where there is conflict is between Christianity or the theistic religions generally, between Christianity and the thought that evolution, that we have come to be here by way of evolution, and that evolution is unguided, undirected, unplanned, purposeless, words of that sort. If evolution is unguided, and we have come to be by virtue of evolution, then it wouldn't be correct, wouldn't be right to say that God has, for example, created us, created human beings in his image, as both Christians and Jews and some Muslims assert. If God has created us in his image, what that means is he had a certain thing in mind. He wanted us to be a certain way. And then however he accomplished the creation, he did it in such a way as to accomplish, bring about that particular end, that there be creatures of that sort. And of course that involves guiding and planning and orchestrating. So I say there is no conflict between evolution just as such and the theistic religions, Christianity, mere Christianity. No conflict there. Where there is conflict is between Christianity and the thought that evolution is unguided. That's where there is conflict. Conflict between the thought that evolution is unguided on the one hand, and on the other hand, the idea that God has created us human beings in his image. All right? Nevertheless, though, there's a whole choir of distinguished experts who assert exactly that evolution is unguided, is unplanned, unorchestrated by God or by anyone else. So, for example, here's George Gaylord Simpson. He says, man, and I would add in parentheses, no doubt woman as well, man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. I suppose in principle you could say that's true for man and not for woman, but it would be a sort of unusual view, right? To think that man is a process of some purposeless natural process, but woman isn't. Well, I don't want to discuss that much further. That could lead to dangerous territory. Then there is Stephen Jay Gould, who says, if the evolutionary tape were to be rewound and then let go forward again, the chances are we'd get creatures of very different sorts. All right, and the chances are that we probably wouldn't get anything like Homo sapiens, so he thinks. And here's a particularly eloquent statement of this thesis by Richard Dawkins in his book, The Blind Watchmaker. Now, Richard Dawkins has been in the news lately, along with others of the so-called new atheists, or the four horsemen of atheism, not the four horsemen of the apocalypse, not even the four horsemen of Notre Dame, but the four horsemen of atheism. And one of these four horsemen is Dawkins. This book of his, The Blind Watchmaker, I think is a very good book. He's written a more recent book called The God Delusion, which I think is a very bad book, more like an ignorant screed than a real contribution to any particular discussion or discipline. But The Blind Watchmaker is a good book. And here's what he says. He says, early on in the book, he says, all appearances to the contrary, the only watchmaker in nature is the blind forces of physics, albeit deployed in a very special way. A true watchmaker has foresight. He designs his cogs and springs and plans their interconnections with a future purpose in his mind's eye. Natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin discovered and which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of all life, has no purpose in mind. It has no mind and has no mind's eye. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of watchmaker in nature, it is the blind watchmaker. All right, that's the blind, natural selection is the blind watchmaker. And the subtitle of this book is, now the very subtitle, Why the Evidence of Evolution Reveals a Universe Without Design. All right? Now, why does Dawkins think that natural selection is blind and unguided? Why does he think that the evidence of evolution reveals a universe without design? Well, in this book, he really does three things. First, he recounts some of the fascinating anatomical details of certain living creatures and of their behavior. So, for example, he talks about bats, and when he does this, he's very good. He's very good in explaining and exploring and describing the natural world. He talks about bats and how they can fly through a completely darkened cave, no light at all, with stalactites hanging from the ceiling and stalagmites rising from the floor, or maybe it's the other way around, but whatever. Can fly through at an enormous rate of speed and not so much as brush any of them. By virtue of they have a kind of sonar, right? The bats send out little squeaky sounds and receive these sounds, bounce off various objects that come back. By virtue of them, the bat can do this kind of navigation. Secondly, he tries to refute arguments for the idea that blind, unguided evolution could not have produced some of the wonders of the living world. So going all the way back to Darwin's time, there were people, St. George Mivart, for example, who said, well, there are certain things, certain kinds of features of animals, certain kinds of organs that just could not have come about by virtue of blind, unguided evolution. The eye was a kind of favorite example. Well, Dawkins does what he can to try to refute these arguments. And third, he makes suggestions as to how these, the ones like eyes and so on, and other organic systems could have developed by way of unguided evolution, all right? The form of his main argument, though, here's the form of the main argument, i.e., the argument for the conclusion that evolution reveals a universe without design, all right? Now, if I could, I'd write this down on a blackboard, but despite our being extremely high-tech, we don't have a blackboard. So pay very careful attention, okay? The premise, then, is an argument that has a premise and a conclusion. The premise is we know of no irrefutable objections to its being biologically possible that all of life has come to be by way of unguided Darwinian processes, all right? We know of no irrefutable objections to its being biologically possible that all of life has come to be by way of unguided evolution. That's the premise. The conclusion is all of life has come to be by way of unguided Darwinian processes. As far as I can make out, that's the form of his main argument. I mean, that is the form of the argument for the conclusion that evolution reveals a universe without design. The argument really is it's possible, so it must have happened. Or nobody has proved it to be impossible, therefore it happened, okay? Now, philosophers sometimes give uncogent arguments, and I must confess I've done the same thing myself on occasion, but they hardly ever come up with arguments that are as sort of wildly uncogent as that argument. I mean, the argument is it's possible that this happened, therefore it did happen. Imagine if I come home and tell my wife that President Obama has decided there is to be a new medal for philosophy struck, and I'm to be the first recipient. Well, she says, what makes you think that? And I say, nobody's proved it impossible. Not a good argument, right? As far as I can see, that's the only argument there is in that book for the conclusion that all of life has come to be by way of unguided Darwinian processes, or that the evidence of evolution reveals a universe without design. Okay, that's the first part of what I want to say. Now I want to go further, and I want to argue that there is a real, how can I put this? A real tension between evolution, the scientific theory of evolution on the one hand, and naturalism on the other. Where here I take naturalism to be the idea that there is no such person as God or anything like God, all right? Dawkins would be a naturalist, Daniel Dennett would be a naturalist, lots and lots of other philosophers nowadays are naturalists. Some people say that naturalism is the orthodoxy of the academy, and that might be right. In any event, that's what naturalism is, the idea that there's no such person as God or anything like God. So naturalism is stronger than atheism. You could be an atheist without being a naturalist if, for example, you thought there was something a lot like God but distinct from God. Plato's ideas, for example, or the Stoics' nous, or something like that. You could be an atheist without rising to the full heights of naturalism, but you couldn't be a naturalist without being an atheist, okay? Now, what I want to argue is that you can't sensibly believe both naturalism and evolution. So, when I speak of naturalism, I'm going to take naturalism to include materialism with respect to human beings. Okay, so I'm taking naturalism to include materialism with respect to human beings. If you object and say, well, a naturalist doesn't have to be a materialist about human beings, okay, then what I'm really arguing against is naturalism, materialism, and evolution, saying you can't sensibly hold all three of those things, all right? Now, a materialist about human beings thinks that there is no immaterial soul or self or anything like that. Descartes, for example, thought that a human being was really an immaterial substance, in that respect, like God himself, an immaterial substance that was related to a particular material object, namely his or her body, all right? So Descartes thought what he really was a thing that wasn't a material object at all, but rather an immaterial self or soul, something like that, which could use a particular body. So, for example, I can use this body, you can use your body, and the like, all right? The materialist says that isn't true, and that a human being is just a material object through and through. And what I want to argue now is that you really can't sensibly be a naturalist, someone who thinks there's no such person as God and also thinks human beings are material objects, and believe in evolution. And the first premise of my argument is this: the probability that, well, let me back up just a bit. This argument has to do with what we could call our cognitive faculties, memory, for example, and perception, whereby you learn about the external world. Thomas Reid talked about sympathy, whereby you can tell what someone else is thinking or feeling, quite often just by looking at their face. I can tell sometimes that my wife is annoyed at some little silly thing I did just by looking at her, all right? Maybe induction, whereby you can learn about the future from your experience of the past and the like. These are our cognitive faculties, and we take them to be reliable. I mean, we just automatically assume that they are. I just automatically assume, without any kind of argument, that there are lots of people in front of me because that's the way it looks to me, all right? The first premise of this argument is that the probability that our faculties are reliable, that they give us truth about the world, that the beliefs they produce in us are for the most part true, the probability that they are reliable, given naturalism and evolution, is low. So there I'm talking about the probability of one proposition given on the assumption that some other proposition is true, right? Conditional probability, people call it. So, for example, the probability that Jock is a Mormon, given that Jock lives in Scotland, that's pretty low, right? Very few Mormons in Scotland. The probability that Brigham is a Mormon, given that Brigham lives in Salt Lake City, that'll be much higher, okay? So the idea, the probability of one proposition given another. It's sort of like saying what things would be like if the other proposition were true. So here what I'm saying is something like this: if naturalism and evolution were true together, then our faculties would probably not be reliable. That's the first premise. Then the second premise is this: if you see that the first premise is true, and furthermore you believe naturalism and evolution, then you have a defeater for your belief that your faculties are reliable, a reason to give up that belief, a reason not to accept it any longer. So a defeater for a belief I have is another belief I come to have, such that as long as I hold that second defeating belief, I can no longer sensibly, rationally hold the first belief, the defeated one. So what I say then is that in my second premise, if you accept the first premise and you see that the probability of entity of our faculties are reliable, given naturalism and evolution, if you see that that's low, then you have a defeater for the proposition that your faculties are in fact reliable. And if you have a defeater for that, you have a defeater for any belief that is formed on the basis of your cognitive faculties, which of course is all of them. So in particular, then you get a defeater for naturalism and evolution, that thing that you started off by believing. You get a defeater for that. And in this way, believing in naturalism and evolution is, you might say, self-defeating. It shoots itself in the foot. It's self-referentially inconsistent, if you want a more kind of philosophical sounding name for it. All right? Well, now, with respect to this argument, I think it's the first premise that needs the most defense. The first premise is the claim that the probability of your faculties being reliable, given naturalism and evolution, naturalism including materialism, is low. All right? Why think that's true? Well, here's why you should think that's true. If you think about what a belief would be from the point of view of materialism, right, I've got the belief that all men are mortal, that 7 plus 5 equals 12, that, that I live in Michigan, and the like. If you say, well, now, what sort of thing is a belief, if materialism is true? A belief would have to be something like an event, a long-standing event or process in your nervous system, or in my nervous system, since I was talking about my beliefs. That's what a belief would have to be. And a belief would have two different kinds of properties. On the one hand, it would have neurophysiological properties, properties that specified, say, how many neurons there are in this particular process or event, and what the rate of fire is in the various different parts, the rate of fire of these neurons in various different parts of this event, and how the rate of fire in one part depends on the rate of fire in some other part, okay? Neurophysiological properties. Everybody with me so far? Yes. Neurophysiological properties, but then also it's got another property too. A belief would have to have a content. It would have to be the belief that P, for some particular proposition P, it would have to, you might say, somehow reach out and grab a certain proposition, that all men are mortal, that 7 plus 5 equals 12, that I live in Michigan. It would have to reach out and grab one particular proposition as opposed to all the other ones, right? And that proposition would be its content. And now here's the nub of the argument for this first premise. If you ask, what makes a given action occur? What causes a given bit of behavior? So I raised my arm. Suppose a belief is involved in that. Suppose, let's say, I believe I would like a drink of water, so I open this cap, all right? So it's on the basis of that belief. But now, which of the properties, of the two kinds of properties of the belief, is relevant to the causation of that behavior? Well, I think what the relevant properties are those neurophysiological properties. It's by virtue of this beliefs, this structure, sending messages down various nervous channels, these messages arriving in my arm's going up, or my arm's picking up this bottle. It's by virtue of those neurophysiological properties that a belief causes whatever it does. It doesn't cause whatever it causes by virtue of its content. If it had a different content but the same neurophysiological properties, it would still have the same causal effects with respect to behavior. And that means that evolution, natural selection, can't really see belief content at all. It can modify our behavior in the direction of greater fitness, and also modify various neuronal structures and the like, various brain processes and structures in the direction of greater adaptiveness. But it can't modify structures with respect to whether or not they have a certain content. Evolution wouldn't care one way or the other what the content was. And that means if you think about if you think about, say, some other creatures on another planet who, like us, hold beliefs and are also, as materialists think themselves, just material objects, that means that if you ask what the likelihood that any particular belief that they've got has true content, it's going to be more or less 50-50. Could be true, could be false. Evolution would have had no way of modifying this creature's faculties in the direction of greater truth or more truth with respect to the contents of these beliefs. So if that's true, if the probability with respect to any belief is of being true is 50-50, then the likelihood that your cognitive faculties are reliable, that say they produce a predominance of true beliefs over false, that's going to be pretty low. If you have, say, 100 different independent beliefs, and the probability with respect to any one of them that is true is roughly 50-50, then the likelihood that, say, 3/4 of those beliefs are true, that's going to be very low. That'll be something like 1 out of 1,000,000 or so. So then that's the argument for the first premise, that the probability of our faculties being reliable on naturalism and evolution is low. And I'm trusting that you remember the rest of the argument, because I've used up my time and I won't say anything more. But just by way of conclusion, here I said I wouldn't say anything more, and I just made a liar out of myself. By way of conclusion, I don't think there's any conflict at all between Christian belief or theistic belief more generally and evolution, but I do think there is conflict between evolution on the one hand and naturalism on the other. Thank you.